So whatever happened to manners? That's what we've been talking about on Life Talks the last several episodes. And, you know, as our society continues to change, morph, some would say evolve, I think there's some things that are deteriorate.
What is it you're not wanting to say, Dan? Well, yeah, there's something you're not saying.
There were several things I left off that list. I'm trying to start off on a positive.
Okay, we're all going to try positive. Let's see how long Dan and I can say positive.
How successful we are, but you know, just the simple things that. You know, there used to be a term, and probably not a good term to use anymore, but it was a matter of breeding. It was a matter of education. It was a matter of civilization.
So here's the thing. That term has so many connections to me with like the early like eugenics movement, the Margaret Sangers who were like, let's help breed humans, that there's enough connection that there's got to be another word.
You think that was the origin of that?
Yeah. So as like a quick history lesson. So early 1900s, it was popular among intellectuals to actually believe that we should make human society better by breeding them the way that we do horses. So
it's like, out of town.
Yes. So this was called eugenics, and there's positive versus negative eugenics. So positive eugenics was this kind of idea. This is like, imagine rich people in like the first class smoking lounges of like the Titanic, like that kind of situation. And they'd be like, well, maybe if we just get all the healthy people together, then, you know, eventually we get a healthier society. There'll be fewer people getting sick and stuff like that. Negative eugenics was the opposite of that, was more like, let's get the unhealthy people to not be having babies. Because if they're having so many babies, like, this is a problem. So Margaret Sanger, who is the founder of Planned Parenthood, was a negative eugenics type person. There was a lot of overlap with that in racism. There was a lot of ways that obviously poor Black people got kind of thrown into the mix there. But sometimes it wasn't about race. Sometimes it was more of a like healthy versus not healthy, kind of what is best for society. And so anyway, anytime I hear the word breeding, that's what comes to mind.
So welcome to Life Talks, where every week we learn something new about the world.
At least one of us.
Etymology and all kinds of things. And by the way, that person speaking was Josh Brahm, who is our executive producer at Life Talks. He's also the founder and president of the Equal Rights Institute, which speaks up for those who are often left to the whims of people that have less than respectful motives in the way that they navigate their life, which is a nice way to say lack of respect for life sometimes.
We're being very positive so far. Until I got into eugenics. It didn't take me that long,
and I just didn't realize I was using the vernacular of the eugenicists, so shame on me. But back to what we were talking about, which is, do manners have a place in the modern world that we know? Or have they become these obsolete, hanging on rituals and traditions that really have no great value? But I'm going to try to make the case that some of them are worth hanging on to.
Absolutely.
And that's what we've been doing. Everything from saying please and thank you, holding the door open for others, giving up your seat for somebody who's elderly or pregnant. When is it appropriate to use strong language? Respect for flags and veterans.
Debate about that.
So if you have missed these previous episodes, I would urge you to go back and listen to them. Some of them will probably irritate you a little bit, but that's okay. That's okay, because we're trying to provoke you to thought. Today, we're going to, and by the way, I'm Dan. I'm one of the teaching pastors. I guess I should get my routine down, right? One of the teaching pastors at Life Fellowship
We're in part 5 of this. Who's showing up to part 5 in the beginning of this?
You know, you'd be surprised how people...
It's on you at
people
this point.
Sometimes drop in midstream. So,
all right.
But here's one that I think is really interesting and has changed during my lifetime. When is it appropriate to use physical force or abstain from using physical force?
Yeah.
These are conversations I think it's really important that we should be having with our children.
Yes.
Now, I grew up in a different time.
Yeah.
And so I don't necessarily think that the response that was very common in my generation is necessarily the most biblical response.
Tell me more.
Well, I think
because I imagine they were trying to be more biblical than arguably the people are now. Like I imagine conservative parents who are like trying their best. What do you think was the difference
Well,
there?
I think this is the issue. Sometimes we interweave cultural mores with biblical values.
Yes.
Inappropriately.
Agreed. Yes.
Inappropriately.
Agreed.
Yeah. So sometimes we want to rationalize or
religiousify.
Our cultural values by sprinkling them with enough scripture to make them sound spiritual or spiritually based.
I imagine. Well, I agree with that, but I wonder if like a lot of times we're tricking ourselves. Like we actually believe, because if we're all hanging out with people who all kind of say similar Christian-y, cultural kinds of things, then you just kind of like assume like, of course, this thing that I'm saying that actually is more of a cultural thing than a biblical thing. They'll think it's a biblical thing.
I think also there's something unique about the American experiment and the American heritage and culture and so forth. And of course, our history is very, very short. We're 250 to 400 years, depending on when you want to nail down the beginning of our culture as opposed to the founding of our country. But there's this rugged American individualism. There's this notion, don't tread on me, that is part of our heritage, a part of American culture. And because, we were also founded to some degree by Puritans and people escaping religious persecution, I think throughout the course of our history, there have been efforts to kind of merge the two. And so I think we at least need to have an honest discussion about whether it is appropriate for those to still be merged. Or if they were ever to have been merged.
It's at least complicated. Can we at least agree it's complicated?
It is complicated. And the Bible's very, very clear. As much as is possible, live peaceably with all people. So that ought to be, for me, that is the overarching principle that would require that we do our best to de-escalate. And maybe one of these times, and you probably know more about this than I do, Josh, but I'd honestly like to go into some of the Catholic teaching on this, because I think of the areas in which there is a very thoughtful understanding of when to use violence, the just war theory, those kind of things, that the Catholics have done as good a job as anybody I know in being able to separate a lot of those things out and approach them from, a Christian worldview at least. And so, but here's the thing. Today, I remember very clearly when bullying became a buzzword in education. And it was in the early to mid 2000, 5, 6, 7, 8, that range. I've actually read some articles about how that became, there was actually a social justice component to it, and so forth.
I don't know anything about that.
Well, the idea is that bullying moved away from just a physical response to a verbal response to a things said, things left unsaid, and it just kept growing. The definition of it did. And I think today we see that among some of the debates that you see people do on the internet, that by not agreeing with a certain position, somehow that's making you feel less than, which is a form of bullying. And so forth. But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about, kids on the playground saying cruel and stupid things to people, mocking people for things that are outside of their control, or even things that are inside their control. And then the physical intimidation that often came with that. Now, again, being reared in a Christian home and so forth, there were times when, my parents very, very clearly taught not being passive, but certainly not being aggressive, that you didn't return what someone had done for you simply because they had done it to you.
Right. Two wrongs don't make
wrongs don't make right. But at the same time, again, and I don't know how much this is cultural, but, my dad was a farm boy. We grew up in the Midwest. It was a different era. And there was a time when I was getting thumped regularly by another kid, and my dad finally said, "Why don't you stand up for yourself? And if he's going to take a swing at you, take a swing back." Which is ironic, because I actually did what he said, and the other kid was crying and so forth. He ran to his parents, who were with my parents in the same room, and I walked up to my dad and I said, "Dad, I did just what you said. I hauled off and socked him." But
then did he stop hitting you?
He did. He did.
He was hitting you up until the point. Is that what you meant by thumping? You just like show up and just slug you,
shoving me, pushing me, and he was my age, my size, everything else, and just kids being kids. Kids are stupid. They would do things like that.
ground, and then I've got clarification questions for you. Like I basically agree in that situation you described. I think that you did the right thing. I think that I'm open to an argument that I don't know enough about what you tried before that, if you tried anything more diplomatic, but like I do believe that it is just true that with a lot of bullies, the only response that will actually end up changing anything is a strong, forceful response that sometimes you can give just once, and then a lot of times the bully stops at that point. So there's agreement there. Clarification questions about what do you think is bullying? Because it sounds like you agree that like people being like physical with kids, that can be bullying.
I think there's also verbal bullying.
Okay, so tell me about that.
I think when you're in a position of power or authority, that you can use words to bully and intimidate.
What if it's just like kids on a playground though? Like they're peers, sort of.
And that's where I get a little frustrated because sometimes part of growing up is learning how to work through conflict.
Yes.
And that requires, I think, some training, but some of it is life experience. There are life experiences that come with having to work through a resolve.
Yes.
Things like taking turns.
Yeah.
Things like how do you determine on a kickball game whether somebody was out or not?
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to come to fisticuffs at the same time. There's a good old fashioned word, fisticuffs. Man, I sound like grandpa there. But
that's when people were fighting each other with their fists.
Yeah, in the streets of Dodge City, right? But the hovering of the helicopter parenting generation, and to some extent, some overreactions on the parents. For instance, I think if you go to the school authority and principal for every perceived episode of bullying or slight or whatever,
agreed,
is not in the long term helpful. Now, if your kid's getting again physically injured or cruelly treated, that it's affecting their mental health and so forth, then I think the interventions and information are required. But I think the typical kids, being kids with a fallen nature, a sin nature, are from time to time going to misbehave. And part of maturing is the ability to work through conflict without it going to blows, without it using inappropriate language, without it involving intimidation and manipulation.
So I think we have a ton of common ground there, because I think tell me if you agree with this. I think like the way that I process that is that yes, obviously there's physical bullying. There absolutely, I believe that can also be verbal bullying and emotional bullying. I don't think every taunt or insult is bullying per se, but I think there can be bullying that has never gotten physical. And that is where those opportunities for the conflict resolution that kids need to learn can come from. Like those opportunities can come from legit bullying. It can still be bullying, but we can still have the opportunity to try to resolve it. One step at a time.
Pendulums tend to swing. And they tend to swing far and wide. So one of the problems, I think, is we've kind of gone to a place where, all right, we're going to step out behind the schoolhouse and settle this, son. So that pendulum has swung over to the other side where every slight and so forth becomes potential legal action or negligence or something. And I think, again, I'm always looking for the golden mean.
Right. What's in the middle
What's in the middle, what's healthy, what follows biblical patterns. And again, I think that's one of the things the scripture says, as much as it is possible. But I think there are some circumstances, and I was taught these, and I believe in them today, you would always rise to defend the defenseless. Or the vulnerable. So and
that's been big in my family. We really raised our kids with like stand up for little kids who are being and they have. They've
but here's the case though that it gets a little sticky. Because I was always taught you stand up for girls. You intervene. Particularly my sisters, and I did on more than one occasion. However, if you come from a more progressive mindset, that can be seen. I
have a solution, I think.
Well, okay, let's hear what.
So as someone who's been becoming closer, like have had increasingly more in common with people who have progressive views, I would think that like as a kid, I remember at preschool, I was the one standing up for the girls. We had two girls and everyone else were boys. Like 30 boys and two girls. And I always was friends with girls more than boys. I always identified more with the artists, the musicians. There's a musician from 4. So like I hung out with them while the boys were throwing dirt clods at us, right? Like, and I would stand up for them. And I would totally still think that's a good thing. I would just like, maybe if I were telling my kids now, I might not say just stand up for girls. I would just be like, stand up for vulnerable people.
Yeah.
Who are the people who are most likely to be attacked? There are guys that are kind of smaller in stature or maybe, struggling with their sexuality or whatever, that are getting terribly mocked and sometimes violently. And they're not girls. So I just be like, who are the people who are vulnerable? The people that are the least likely to be cool. Find them, protect them, stand up for them when no one else is. And I think a lot of times that's going to include girls. That's totally fine.
And you may disagree with me on this. Yeah. I do also think, though, that there are some things that the Bible may not implicitly say where a cultural value has emerged. And I don't think the fact that it is not implicitly addressed in Scripture is reason not to practice the cultural norm. So the Bible does, it has the greater principle that you just addressed, and I think that is the case. But I also think there's a genuine, general acknowledgement in Scripture that men are to take leadership.
Yes.
That we have been equipped biologically, but we have also been called spiritually to protect the vulnerable and to protect women.
I agree with
and
that.
so if you decide to start something with my wife, or if you start, or my sister, or whatever, I feel
you
immediately
have a special duty.
Yeah, special duty, a special responsibility to be protective.
Totally.
And I think, I think these are important conversations for parents to be having with their children and also among themselves and even among other parents. Guess what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I'm not going to, I'll beat these to death if given the opportunity. So I'm going to, here's one I love about the South. This happened to me this morning.
Yeah.
And the difference between driving
I've got one quick school principal getting involved story that might be useful before we move on. If we want to do one more thing, there is I'll just throw out our kids have gone to school, and the school that William and Eli have gone to for a while, there was a bullying problem at the school. And we didn't get involved right away. It wasn't like, oh my goodness, someone has said something mean to William. Like, it wasn't like that. Like, William's a strong kid. Like, he can kind of handle it. But like, we're kind of keeping an eye on it. But as he would try all the right things and trying to communicate with the teachers and things, like, there wasn't just enough attention being made to it. And there was this really systemic problem happening. And it eventually got to the point where I went to the school and said, this is a thing that's going on. There's a pattern, and it seems like no one's listening to him. And it wasn't long after that we pulled him out of that school because it had gotten so bad. And then it sounds like they handled it, because now, ironically, our youngest is going to that same school, and there's not really bullying things going on. And so I know some of it can be teachers and stuff. So I'm like, sometimes I feel like we should get involved and be like, hey, what's going on?
And I think that's where discretion, I think it's really important to. My dad got involved in a bullying situation on the school bus with me. I was getting, teased, partially because I was protecting my sister, but also because we were known to be Christians. And it got worse and worse. And one day my sister got off the bus and she was crying, and my dad, you didn't mess with this little girl. So he called the bus driver that night and said, this had better stop. And you don't want me to come out on the school bus and insist that it stops. Yeah. And so the very next day, as we got on the bus, the school bus driver said, now you two sit right here in the front seat. It was a punishment. Yeah. His response was an overreaction. Rather than deal with the problem, it was literally getting back at us because Dad had called him. So there are times, sometimes entire problems can disappear with one person leaving. Or with one person
one person doing the right thing and having a little bit of empathy. Like, oh my goodness.
Yeah. And I think both of those are situations in which we ought to be discussing them with our kids and training them. Yes. And at some point, if your boys are playing tackle football, somebody's gonna get a cheap shot, and they're gonna go at it for a minute, and then they'll be okay. Yes. But it's just this moment of and they're wearing football gear, so nobody's going to get hurt except their hands.
And it's good for them to get a little bit hurt too. Like,
Yeah.
I think it's good for kids to do risky play and get kind of hurt. I think they should be getting bruises.
And to make up afterwards, and to be able to be friends, and not lifelong enemies.
Well, I just mean, like, sometimes it's good for them to be getting accidentally hurt. Like sometimes people are like, we got to be really protective. I'm like, they should be getting bruises.
Putting them in plastic or
breaking
plastic
arms.
bubbles.
Those are good things.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So going on to the next one, it is simply how we behave in traffic.
Yeah.
Now, I'm a bit of a hypocrite because I sometimes kind of turn into the city in which I am currently driving. So when we lived in Miami, it was really...
I've never driven in Miami.
Oh, my
What's
goodness.
it like to drive in Miami?
like driving through a war zone, through Kabul.
Miami, Florida or Miami, Ohio? Sorry.
Miami, Ohio.
I'm just assuming.
No, Florida. Miami,
Okay.
Florida.
I'm just making sure. I'm just making sure. Okay.
Heavy congested traffic.
Okay.
People from all over different parts of the world, all converging on interstates that were not adequately built.
Yeah.
And people regularly would get shot. Road rage. Florida has very liberal gun.
That's
so
crazy
but you
to
usually drove with
shoot
one hand on the wheel and the other hand on the horn. And then I come up to Charlotte. Where they will, and I've had this happen. I had it happen this morning where somebody is blocking traffic so that they can be the generous person who lets somebody in, but they had to cross a lane and so, but not a peep. Everybody just behaved because this is the South.
It's pretty chill.
What they were probably saying in their cars did not match their actions.
Sure,
but,
right.
Again,
but there's not a lot of like laying on horns the way they do like in New York
and even if I do
San
have
Francisco.
to, if somebody's like sleeping through it or on their phone, this is my pet peeve, on their phone when the light turns green or whatever, you don't, in Miami, you just laid on the horn until, and here you.
Have you ever done that? Have you ever laid on the horn?
I told you the story
I don't
about
know
the
if
time
I've ever done it.
No, I have. I'm not proud of that, but I have, yeah. So, I'm not a real Southerner, so I'm a Midwesterner.
Right.
But no, I've done it inappropriately, unbiblically, so at times.
Yeah.
So I'm confessing my sins, Father Josh.
Yeah. I've confessed plenty in this series, so at least it's not just
But here's
me.
the thing about training our children in this. This is something that is caught more than it is taught too.
Yes.
I
That's
think
a great point.
Aggressive drivers are going to they're going to normalize behavior that's not necessarily healthy.
Yeah.
And
they're
truly,
going to drive your kids around. Like they're going to watch.
And in some parts of the world, it is common. Like, people don't know how to cue correctly in large portions of the world. Like when I'm in Asia and they call they're loading your plane. You're loading the plane.
Yeah.
And honestly, it is the most unnerving thing. Plus, I get a little claustrophobic around people, but
me too.
It is survival of the fittest. Don't care if you're old, young, and it just is really interesting.
It's a different thing.
And here we consider that behavior a little bit uncivilized, and we would get indignant about it. So we don't also always are able to transfer those things culturally as smoothly as we would like to be able to do so. But I think in the end, teaching the principle of in honor preferring one another whenever it is possible, whenever it is reasonable, whenever it doesn't inconvenience somebody else, is a manner and a way of living that I think we're paying too little attention to in our current generation.
Yes.
We only got through 2 today, but we got plenty more to go.
That's true.
So Josh, thanks as always for engaging me with these different points of view. And if you are listening to this series and maybe you can think of some other things, write them down. If we haven't gotten to them by the end, send them to us and we will try to have an addendum show where we address your preferences as well in terms of just being good citizens, good people that represent Christ well, with dignity, with honor, showing the biblical values that we are called to be as ambassadors of Christ. If you ever want to send us a note, you can do so at lifetalks@lifecharlotte.com. Share us, if you would, on your social media platforms so that we can continue to reach others with some things that we hope stimulate your thinking. And so until next time, thanks as always for joining us here at Life Talks.